So let me introduce two people. One is the moderator. Let's see if I can read it. Rebecca Ladd, who was the founding member of this center and also PhD scholar here. I don't know how far or near you are to the completion. Her new job is a minister of evangelism at First Methodist Church right here in downtown Tulsa. Also, she is a PhD candidate, her specialty is in secularism, nuns until recently Uruguay. So it is our joy to have Rebecca to moderate this session. Also, I need to introduce Carly. Carly is a PhD scholar. Her research interest is in the intersection of sexual violence and Pentecostalism. She coordinates distance education and assessment and editing at the ORU Graduate School of Theology and Ministry. She's going to be the engager. I will tell you what that is later, but Rebecca, please.
Ready? Well, it's my honor to introduce Robert McBain. My first interaction with Robert was calling him during the pandemic to ask him about this brand new idea that I had heard of. It was a rumor in my mind. I didn't know if it would be a reality or not, but I had heard that Oral Roberts University was offering a PhD. And so I called this person named Robert. I said, is this a good time? He said, well, we're all working from home and there are children in the background, but sure, what do you want to know? And so that seems like a long time ago now. But Robert was really, he was one of the, you can give us your role, but he helped bring this PhD to, he was a guinea pig. So he helped with the administration and then also is one of the first students. So he has prepared the first dissertation. No pressure at all, but we'd like you to present, show us what's possible. So Robert and I went from that informal conversation to fellow classmates. Now I'm a candidate, let's say at one side of the candidacy process where I have a dissertation to write. He's on the other side where he has written a dissertation and is here to tell us about it. So I'm gonna let Robert take it away, and then please do, if you have questions, please do come up with your questions. We'll have time for that here at the end, and go for it, Robert.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. I want to expressively say thank you to my wife for being here. She said she wanted to see her husband in his element, so I guess this is my element. And I'm really delighted to be here because this is, in a sense, this presentation and coming to the climax of the dissertation writing phase of actually having something that's going up for defence and will one day be publishable is what it's all about. And I feel in some respects as well as that what I'm about to present and what I did my dissertation on, it's God honouring the struggles and the suffering of the people, the participants who I interviewed. So they might never know that I've been here and I've spoke to you about their experiences, but I see a redemptive aspect in that we could all learn from the participants and that we as church leaders, scholars, could engage with their experiences in ways that's only going to build up the church. So that's kind of my takeaway before beginning. So this is my dissertation presentation of the findings. And this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to present my PhD dissertation research, of which was a grounded theory study in how Pentecostals experience depression. And you could expect this presentation to follow this outline. I'm going to give some background information. I'm going to give a brief presentation of the methodology, not too much, because I guess I wrote a lot in the document we handed out. Then I'm going to present the theory, explaining how US Pentecostals experience depression. I'm going to put the theory in dialogue with the literature, so that's going to be a little bit of discussion. And then if you're still awake, we'll suggest some practical considerations. I'll not be offended. So let's begin with the dissertation, with the presentation. Now, this is Heather. That's not a real name and that's not a real picture. This is a lady I got off the internet, but I put it there so you could maybe emote her face a little bit. But this is Heather. She's a real participant who I interviewed. And I'm going to give you a little bit of her story just to present the theory before we move on. She first experienced depression 40 years ago after losing 5 prepartum babies over 10 years. Sadness, hopelessness, apathy, loss of motivation, suicidal ideation, and thoughts of self-harm characterized her depression. She believed that if she remained faithful, the Spirit would empower her to overcome her loss, yet reality defied her expectations. She struggled with daily functioning and neglected her household responsibilities, so that all the burden of earning and taking care of the home fell on her husband. She encountered judgment at church. One of the elders' wives says to her, it must not be God's will for you to have children. In a Pentecostal church setting that expected testimonies of healing and divine breakthroughs, the church appeared to lack the language and framework to process Heather's loss. Her grief made her feel like a failure, and she withdrew herself from the church community that had made up most of her life. Living in this context, she noticed attitudes and behaviours that were not of God, like the remark of the elder's wife. These attitudes and behaviours within her community contrasted the message of love and care she heard from the pulpit and what she read about in the Bible. And she questioned why people were treating her this way. She also questioned why the Spirit had not protected her children in childbirth, why God hadn't blessed her like the other women, and why the Pentecostal promise of the Spirit's power did not account for her reality. She wondered why there was no space for stories like hers. Heather turned to medication for help. It numbed her depression and helped her function in her daily life. She also went to Christian counselling, which helped her reframe her suffering within a biblical framework while equipping her with coping strategies. She also sought clarity through Christian self-help books and sermons, you know, the type of materials you get on YouTube, preach from the pulpit, or you might see in Mardell's. She continued to question, this was her question throughout this, if the Spirit was and is present, why did I lose the babies? And why 40 years later was not she over this loss? And for how long would she have to live with the church treating her like an anomaly? And that's where Heather lived, caught between what she expected to happen against what actually did happen. Now, Heather's experiences of depression are not unique. She is one of 7% of Americans who live with depression and among the 15% who will experience it at some point in their life. The World Health Organization calls depression the largest disability. Now, given that depression surveys among Christians reflect national depression rates, it's reasonable to infer that there are many Pentecostals, just like Heather, who are experiencing depression. Another thing we need to know is that Heather's experiences of depression didn't happen in a vacuum. As with all the participants, she was deeply shaped and embedded in her Pentecostal context. Now, United States Pentecostalism emerged in the early 1900s because of various historical, theological, and sociological factors. And as we all know from being here at the PhD program, it now comprises so many diverse groups that it's often hard to keep track of them, but they all tend to focus on the experience of activity of the Spirit in a person's life. Now, social constructionism provides a valuable framework for understanding Pentecostalism because it theorizes how the social-cultural context shapes their understanding and expression of the Spirit. So within this framework, David Curry argues that as Pentecostalism developed throughout the 20th century, US cultural ideas such as resilience, success, and progress shaped Pentecostal pneumatology. As a result, Pentecostals see the Spirit as active, tangible, and transformative, and that empowers people's life to overcome adversity and succeed in ways that align with God's soteriological and eschatological purposes. And this was true of the participants. They believed the Spirit should be active in their lives. They believed that the Spirit would empower them to succeed, that it would shield them from adversity, and that if bad things did happen, it would empower them to overcome those things. Now, just as the socio-cultural context influences how Pentecostals understand and express themselves, it also shapes how people experience other aspects of life, such as depression. There's lots of research that provides compelling evidence of how cultural norms, social expectations, and environmental stressors deeply influence how depression is understood and experienced. However, there's little, if any, research exploring how Pentecostalism as a social system shapes Pentecostals' experiences of depression. Now, one of the few researches that I found was Joy Allen's phenomenological study of UK Pentecostal experiences of depression. That's the only significant study I found that explores the relationship between Pentecostalism and depression. And she argues that Pentecostals' social interaction with other people, themselves, their diagnosis, their church community, and God shapes their experiences of depression. Now, while Allen's study sheds light on what it's like for Pentecostals to experience depression, it offers limited engagement into how the Pentecostal context actually shapes depression experiences. Most, if not all, the literature that is available about Pentecostalism and depression tends to focus on clinical issues, Pentecostal perceptions of depression, and it suggests methods of treatment and intervention. Now, this lack of literature may create misconceptions about the reality of depression for Pentecostals who live with it. For instance, Joy Allen argues that depressed Pentecostals find that the church worship services lack the space and time for them to connect with the Spirit in ways that help them process their feelings, and that they also feel pressure to conceal their struggles because of fear and judgment in church. Consequently, their worship and church experiences are generally negative. Now, Joy Allen's claims on that point contradicts the claims of a larger body of Pentecostal literature that emphasizes the nourishing aspects of Pentecostal theology and practice. The literature gap also allows others, such as clinicians, lay Pentecostals, theologians, preachers, church leaders, to impose their interpretations of depression on depressed Pentecostals without fully understanding the challenges they face. For example, research into African American Pentecostal preachers suggests they often attribute depression to negative attitudes or as a failure of faith, and that they encourage congregants not to use medication or rely on treatments outside the church. My own research into how Pentecostal preachers preach about depression highlights how they believe faulty thinking, such as incorrect beliefs, negative thought patterns, or a lack of faith cause depression. These interpretations can create stigma and shame, strip sufferers of their voices, and pressure them to internalize harmful narratives that frame their struggles as personal or spiritual failings. Triumphalist frameworks within Pentecostalism, emphasizing spirit-empowered victory through faith, they also reinforce these types of external interpretations. By promoting a vision of success and overcoming adversity, triumphalist theology creates normative expectations that shape how Pentecostals view themselves and their struggles. However, when individuals cannot meet these expectations, they feel inadequate and may be alienated from their community. Now, given the complexities surrounding Pentecostalism and depression, including misconceptions stemming from the literature gap, the relationship between Pentecostalism and depression deserves closer attention. Hence my dissertation and hence my research question, which is, how do Pentecostals living in the USA experience depression? Now, Heather was one of 19 participants I've interviewed during my dissertation grounded theory study. Grounded theory itself is a qualitative research method that collects and analyzes data to develop a theory explaining the participants' experiences in relation to the broader social processes that shape those experiences. So by using grounded theory, my dissertation and what this presentation is going to present constructed a theory from the data that explained the relationship between the participants' experiences of depression and the Pentecostal context. Now, I don't want to speak too much about the methodology here because it's in that paper that I handed out. But if you do have questions on it, I will take them at the end. But one thing I want to say is that during the the process of analysis during the grounded theory research and analysis is that I was guided by my own reflexive journey with the data. It guided me to many conversation partners, i.e. literary scholars, but one most prominent one was Paulo Freire. He came out as one of the primary conversation partners. Now, Freire was a Brazilian educator known for his commitment to literacy, education, and social transformation. And Freire's focus on how individuals internalize and respond to social structures and social processes provided a compelling framework for understanding the participants' experiences, how their experiences shaped their depression. And so I want to move on and start presenting the theory. So using grounded theory as my methodology, 3 core concepts emerged that describe the participants' experiences. And you'll see them on the slide there. The 3 core concepts were stressful conditions, depression, disruption, and making sense. And I'll just briefly describe those in a few sentences. So stressful conditions were uncontrollable events or situations that caused the participants emotional or physical strain. We saw that with Heather. She lost her babies. They might also include marital difficulties, change in social roles. One participant went from not being married to being married, and that change in social role was a stressful condition for her. Unexpected life events like accidents, illnesses. Heather's one. Childhood dysfunction. Some of my participants had been abused. Trauma, unresolved pain, and failure to meet social norms. They were singing, that would be our common parlance for it. They were doing things that their Pentecostal community would have classified as a sin. So that's what stressful conditions were. The depression disruption category, it speaks towards how depression actually disrupted the participants' lives. And the participants' descriptions of depression paralleled the clinical criteria. It included pervasive sadness, feelings of worthlessness, apathy, and suicidal ideation, amongst the others. These feelings inhibited how they functioned in their daily lives. So one participant, Linda, spoke of an overwhelming heaviness that made the simplest tasks impossible. Brenda described how she lay in bed, hoping the damp spot on the ceiling would cause the roof to fall in and bury her. New mother, Alicia, this is a lady with a baby a few months old, thought about driving her car off the road, thinking, wouldn't it be good if I was just to die? These emotional struggles left them feeling powerless and feeling that life was out of control. And that lack of agency meant they struggled to authentically express themselves in their personal life and within their church communities. They felt they always had to put on a performance and pretend that everything was okay. Now, the making sense category describes how participants tried to make sense of their experiences and how they tried to respond to stressful conditions and depression. They relied on 3 types of resources: professional and non-professional counselling, the non-professional counselling being perhaps visiting your pastor. They relied on medication, and they relied on Christian consumerist materials like self-help books, like I said, or sermons, YouTube materials, and so forth. Counselling, professional and non-professional counselling, help participants make sense of their struggles through biblical frameworks while also teaching them coping techniques. Participants viewed medication as a gift from God. Medication appeared to create a buffer between their emotions and their thoughts, giving them the mental space to process their experiences. So in Ginger's case, taking medication improved her ability to focus, and it helped her function more effectively at working in her daily life. Like I said, Christian consumer resources were the 3rd subcategory within that main category of making sense. And they help participants find meaning, regulate their emotions, and generally feel less alone. Nathan, for instance, would listen to worship music from a band that he liked, or listen to sermons from a pastor that he liked. He liked the pastor and the music because he felt that person could associate with his experiences. So when he was driving along with in his car, he felt someone was there with him who understood where he was coming from. Now, together, these resources, counselling, medication, and consumer resources, they help participants make sense of their depression experiences and cope with stressful conditions and depression. Now, I've given a brief description of these three categories. Now, the grounded theory doesn't emerge by providing thick descriptions of the categories. The grounded theory explaining the phenomenon arises through looking at the interaction between the categories. And you'll see that there, the Venn diagram demonstrates how the categories overlap, and you see the arrows there. So following the arrows, this is me beginning to nurse out the grounded theory explaining the participants' experiences of depression. Stressful conditions left participants feeling powerless and out of control, which contributed to depression's disruption of their life. Participants found this disruption confusing, as they expected the Spirit to shield them from such challenges or empower them to overcome them. The making sense category demonstrates how participants drew on therapeutic resources to help them understand and manage their condition. However, and there's a little caveat here, because these resources were shaped by and interpreted within a Pentecostal Spirit-empowered framework, the process of making sense actually reinforced the theological expectations that contributed to their distress in the first place. And this set the pattern for a recurrent cycle. So you see the recurrent cycle there. I'm trying to draw that out through the arrows. Then the overlapping areas of the Venn diagram, they're trying to illustrate how each category influences and is influenced by the other categories, creating a tapestry of association and impact that describes the participants' overall experiences. They revealed that the concept of spirit empowerment acted as the contextual framework shaping the participants' overall experiences. The spirit empowered concept there, which I've drawn a circle around the whole process, it was how they interpreted lives and pretty much how they existed in the world, was through this concept of spirit empowerment. And this is something the study keeps returning to. The participants believed the Spirit would enable them to control their lives by eliminating, minimizing, or helping them overcome life's challenges. However, their lived experiences demonstrated otherwise. Now, in this diagram, I've tried to visualize the disconnect between the participants' experiences of spirit empowerment and their realities. And unlike the previous diagram, this diagram depicts the spirit-empowered circle as fractured, signifying that disjunction between expectation and reality. The fissure highlights the persistent tension shaping the participants' experiences as the concept of spirit empowerment served as both a source of meaning and a site of tension. However, something interesting appeared to happen in this space between expectation and reality that I've already hinted at a few times so far, is that participants began to recognize inconsistencies within their Pentecostal context concerning its theological constructions and attitudes and behaviours towards them in the church that were not of God. That's their own term. A deeper analysis suggested that the participants' experiences of living between expectation and reality was actually heightening their self-awareness of how their context shaped their lives. They began questioning where their expectations about life originated, why the Spirit wasn't empowering them as they had been taught to expect, why people in their church responded to them in certain ways, why their struggles were either spiritualized or ignored rather than met with compassion. And they also questioned why they always had to put on a facade at church. Now, this increased self-awareness of their context affecting them is something I'm going to coax out in the discussion. And it's something that links into Paolo Freire being the main conversation partner. But before I move on to the discussion, let me just recap or reiterate the theory. Just take a look at this. So let me restate the theory. I kind of wrote it there in its entirety so you could read along or flick back through it as I recite this. The theory that emerged from the analysis was that the participants lived in the gap between expectations of spirit empowerment and reality. They believed the spirit would eliminate or minimize life's challenges or empower them to overcome adversity, yet stressful conditions demonstrated otherwise. The tension between expectation and reality manifested as depression, which became a stressful condition in its own right. Participants subsequently gravitated towards counselling, medication, and Christian consumer resources to help them cope. However, because these resources were shaped and interpreted through a spirit-empowered framework, they reinforced the same theological paradigm that had shaped their expectations from the outset. Their struggles persisted as a result, leading them to recognise inconsistencies within their Pentecostal communities, theological instructions, and behaviours that were not of God. That's their term, not mine. It was within this unresolved space that they found themselves living in the gap. Hence, the title of my presentation highlights the whole aspect of living in the gap. So now I want to put that theory into discussion with the broader literature. And the goal here is just to examine how living in the gap interacts with existing research, and in so doing, allow new insights to emerge. And as I go through this discussion, I'm going to do it by category. So we'll discuss the stressful conditions, then we'll discuss depression's disruption, and then we'll discuss the making sense. So let's start with stressful conditions. I should say, although I sometimes reference the scholars that I'm appealing to here, I tend not to. I just go on and rattle it off. But note in this section, I am appealing to broader literature, and you'll see it in your handouts there. So just to say, I'm not making this up.
So can I
There's academic input into
clarify for just a minute? So he keeps referencing a handout. There, I think I might be the only person with the copy. So of spirit empowerment and reality, how U.S. Pentecostals experience depression. This is a paper that details what he's talking about. So there are references at the end. This was sent to your professors. And so if you have received it and have read it, you can reference that in your mind. And if you have not received it, then stay tuned. But that's that paper that he's referencing. That's the handout. So please continue.
Yeah, that's what I'm referring to. So it's not really a handout, it's more like a little book. So the stressful conditions. The participants' experiences of living in the gap between expectation and reality wasn't solely a personal psychological struggle. Instead, social forces outside of themselves created the gap. Social science literature argues that people make sense of their lives through shared beliefs, languages, and social interactions. These discursive structures create normative scripts that function as social roadmaps that outline how life is supposed to unfold. Internalizing these scripts gives individuals a sense of stability, allowing them to project themselves into an imagined future. As long as their lives follow the expected trajectory, they retain a sense of control over their lives, which is essential for mental health. However, when life deviates from the script, as with the case of the participants, the disruption destabilizes their sense of self, leading to stress, anxiety, and depression. Now, Pentecostal triumphalism reinforces a particular kind of script, where its beliefs and practices convince believers that faithfulness leads to spirit-empowered outcomes, whether in career, relationship, or personal fulfillment. This expectation of divine intervention reflects what Anthony Giddens describes as colonizing the future, as it provides believers with a sense of certainty about their future through present beliefs, practices, and institutional narratives. In this case, Pentecostal triumphalism conditions believers to shape their decisions, relationships, and aspirations around the assurance that the Spirit will lead them into the life they envision. For the participants, this script structured their life choices. For instance, one participant, Patrice, she grew up believing that the Spirit would prepare a husband for her, so she tried to be led by the Spirit, trusting that her obedience would bring her God-chosen partner into her life. Likewise, Jared's call to ministry at a youth camp shaped his education, career, and marriage choices. Both followed this triumphalist script, believing that faithfulness would yield the envisioned outcomes. Yet when their lives took unexpected turns, instead of helping them process disappointment and change, the script failed to accommodate life's complexities. Participants entered a space between expectation of spirit empowerment and the reality, which the script lacked the language to interpret. Without a theological or social framework to make sense of their off-script experiences, they struggle to reconcile faith with reality. This experience aligns with Dave Corey's concerns. Now, I've mentioned Dave Corey 2 or 3 times, I should say. He wrote a book called What Has Wittenberg to Do with Azusa Street, in which he provides a very good historical overview and assessment of Pentecostal triumphalism. So when I say David Corey, that's who I'm referring to often. Their experiences align with what Dave Corey, I'll start again. The participants' experiences align with Dave Corey's concerns that Pentecostal triumphalism fosters unrealistic expectations, disregards life's complexities, and imposes emotional and intellectual burdens that, when unmet, lead to frustration, blame, guilt, and suffering. And these pressures deepened the participants' distress, reinforcing their feelings of spiritual failure, when in fact, what they were dealing with was the consequences Now, the depression disruption category. So triumphalism shaped the participants' understanding of spirit empowerment. Stressful conditions exposed the fragility of this belief, leaving a gap between expectation and reality. Depression then emerged as a symptom and a consequence of this dissonance, disrupting the participants' daily routine, roles, and relationships. Now, there's nothing new in my research about how depression symptoms disrupted the participants' lives. But what was informative was how depression enhanced their self-awareness, so they became more aware of their context effects on them. Now, studies show that heightened self-reflection can trap individuals in repetitive thought patterns that amplify problems and impair problem solving. However, increased self-reflection may also serve as a coping mechanism, helping individuals process emotions, identify challenges, and generally build resilience through deeper self and contextual awareness. Now, this dual reflexive nature was evident in the participants. They ruminated on their depression, on their stressful conditions and depression's disruption of their lives in ways that were keeping them in a rut, but they also somehow managed to link their experiences to their Pentecostal contexts, hence the dual reflective nature of their experiences. For instance, despite being taught that the Spirit would empower them, participants were questioning why they were script. And this sort of self-awareness, this beginning of self-awareness, extended to their church communities. They began questioning why people who they believed were their friends treated them in ways that they did, why they were being treated in ways that were not of God, and why they had to pretend everything that was okay. Now, the participants' ability to link their experiences with the broader social context, specifically the religious context, suggests that in some capacity, the participants were reflecting on the reality as perceiving subjects. In this way, depression's disruption opened up a more developed understanding of their social world, suggesting that the participants were undergoing a process of consciousness raising. And this is where Paulo Freire comes in. Paulo Freire defines consciousness raising as a process where individuals recognize how their socio-cultural reality shapes their lives and their ability to transform that reality through reflection and action. Life in the Gap then fostered an inherent form of consciousness raising where the tension between expectations and reality deepened the participants' awareness of their social, theological, and personal world. However, while the participants became more aware of inconsistencies in their context and questioned their context effects on them, there were limits to how far this connection went between their personal experiences and the systemic factors. For instance, Nathan questioned why he could not be his authentic depressed self among his family and church, and he questioned what it was about those contexts that forced him to put on a facade. The systemic pressure shaping his experiences, such as the breach of purity culture that led to his depression, his internalized shame, his fear of rejection, and just the general absence of a vulnerable space being available. He seemed to sense the systemic factors constraining his self-expression, but he could not name or critically engage with them. The same was true with Patrice. Her depression stemmed from her failure to meet the Pentecostal ideal of womanhood by marrying and having children. And although she realised how her Pentecostal upbringing set these expectations, her self-awareness only extended so far. All she could do really was uphold a veneer of respectability in a church community that questioned why a 55-year-old woman had never been married or had children. The participants did sometimes change their context by leaving small groups they felt did not understand them, or they felt judged them, or they would sometimes switch churches. But these actions are not a movement towards a transformative action that Brary envisions. Now they're making sense of the gap category. Now, a Brarian interpretation of the participants' inability to link their experiences to the systemic factors shaping those experiences suggests that their context restricted the process. And I would say this is evidenced by their use of therapy. Resources help participants cope with and make sense of their experiences, but in doing so, the resources constrain the participants' capacity to engage with their environment critically. For example, counselling did not help Patrice acknowledge the negative impact of the Pentecostal construct of motherhood on her sense of self. Instead, counselling encouraged her to reinterpret her struggles through a biblical framework, which reinforced her belief that her challenges were part of her spiritual journey rather than a socially constructed process. Likewise, while counselling helped Jolene process the personal effects of illness-related stigma, it did not help her examine the social forces that produced that stigma in the first place. Medication worked in the same way. While it did not foster critical engagement with the external socio-theological structures that shaped their struggles. For instance, medication provided Frank with a safe space that improved his communication and reduced his conflict in his marriage, yet it did not resolve his questions concerning his unfulfilled expectation of the Spirit's role in fulfilling his calling and how he projected that disappointment onto his wife. This limitation reflects social psychiatrist Dan Blazer's claim that antidepressants place excessive responsibility on patients while neglecting the systemic factors that contribute to depression in the first place. The participants' use of medication, counselling, and other consumer resources that I keep on mentioning, self-help books, workshops, television shows, and so forth, YouTube videos, as part of a larger conversation concerning the diffusion of therapeutic knowledge throughout society. Now, therapeutic knowledge, it prioritizes emotional and psychological health, self-fulfillment, and personal transformation as essential to individual well-being. And the societal diffusion of therapeutic culture is evident in Pentecostalism, which frames faith and spirit-mediated piety as personal pathways to actualization and emotional healing, seeing them as proof of the blessings of a close relationship with God. This integration reflects how psychoanalytic discourse recasts the benefits of religious experiences within the framework of emotional health and maturity. Pentecostal triumphalism, emphasizing divine empowerment and victory, reflects this diffusion by reframing self-actualization as spiritual growth, healing as a sign of divine intervention, and success as evidence of spirit-empowered favor. Now, the downside of the diffusion of therapeutic knowledge in society and throughout Pentecostalism is that it focuses on autonomy, self-fulfillment, and self-management at the expense of communal responsibility. Arlene Stein, she's a sociologist, argues that therapeutic culture and psychological discourse cast social problems, and in this case, the deficiency of Pentecostal triumphalism, from the perpetuating institutions onto individuals by suggesting that they learned to process the adverse effects of these institutions through the subjection of self, which is what the participants' use of counselling, medication, and self-help resources did. Now, the danger is that when people therapeutically focus on themselves and their problems, they obscure the broader social factors causing those problems. Linda is an example. Her depression stemmed from her marital difficulties. Her reliance on prayer, Christian self-help books, and women's Bible studies led her to internalize her struggles, making prayer and submission to her husband, and by extension, her mother-in-law's influence over her husband, her only option concerning her marital difficulties. And that focus obscured the influence of strict fundamentalist views of womanhood, views of Christian submission, and the pressures of social forces such as intensive mothering that shaped her self-perception, her relationship with her husband, and even the relationship between her husband and his mother, which in turn affected her marital bond. Therefore, by framing their struggles within a self-focused framework, these resources numbed the consciousness-raising process that Life in the Gap instigated, perpetuating the system that the participants began to question, trapping them still in the gap between spirit-empowered expectations and their lived experiences. So let me recap. Let me recap it. So if you're still awake, I want to recap, right? Pentecostal triumphalism functioned as a normative social script, socializing participants to expect divine protection and spirit empowerment over life's challenges. However, stressful conditions exposed the fragility of this script, creating a gap between expectation and reality that fostered depression. Depression was both a disruptive condition and a catalyst for heightened self-reflection. This self-awareness helped participants connect their struggles to their Pentecostal context, social and theological structures, which created the potential for consciousness raising. Yet the therapeutic resources participants used to navigate this gap reinforced the same spirit-empowered script that shaped their expectations and created and sustained their struggles. Now, this reinforcement constrained their ability to critically engage with their broader systemic issues, shaping their experiences, and limited the transformative potential of the consciousness-raising process depression instigated. Now, I only have like 50 pages left, and we're on to the reflections and implications and contributions section. If you made it this far, you should make it to the end.
Is that realistic expectations? Are we in the gap?
Yeah, you probably are in the gap.
Okay.
So let me just try and nurse some things out of this for you, because there's no point of this this sort of theoretical engagement, so to speak, with participants' experiences, unless we sort of bring it down to some meaningful space where we as scholars and church leaders and whatnot could take it somewhere. So this is what I'm trying to do here, is try and nurse out a few practical considerations. Right, first, I want to say that while this study contributes to understanding the relationship between Pentecostalism and depression, it also points towards a more complex issue, and that complex issue is this. It is that Pentecostalism, with its focus on spirit empowerment, operates as a system in which its theology and practice address and perpetuate the conditions that necessitate its theology and practices. Now, this challenges common assumptions that frame Pentecostalism as an inherently empowering experience, or as an inherently empowering movement. Now, this critique is something that I had to confront during the research. So when I entered the study, I thought that I would find that the Spirit would be empowering the participants to overcome depression. I thought, what's the point even interviewing these folks, because that's what I'm going to find, right? But then I went through the process and I found that they lived in the gap between expectations of spirit empowerment and reality. Now, this misalignment between my expectations and what I expected to find and what didn't, it underscores two key points. The first, it highlights the strength of grounded theory as a method that allows new insights to emerge from the data rather than imposing preconceived frameworks. I'm a Pentecostal, I'm baptized in the Holy Spirit, and I speak in tongues, but yeah, I'm saying these things. So the grounded, it really speaks towards grounded theory as a research methodology that allows new insight to emerge from the data. Second, it reveals how the Pentecostal socio-theological processes shaped the participants' views and my own, reinforcing the discourse of spirit-empowered victory, essentially in the same way that the participants' expectations of spirit empowerment didn't meet their realities. Well, the research findings didn't meet my expectation of spirit empowerment either. It really spoke towards how we share, in a sense, the same social world, and we're impacted by the same discourses that make us think in the same ways. So in the same way, their realities never met their expectations, my reality never met my expectation either concerning this research. So we must also ask why the participants remained embedded in their Pentecostal context, despite recognizing theological and practical inconsistencies. Now, a Frererian interpretation suggests that Pentecostalism shaped the participants' consciousness in ways that constrained them from perceiving and resisting the systemic structures influencing their struggles. Now, while there's many sociological and psychological models that help explain this behavior, I want to go straight to the necessary response. The necessary response to this issue is for those of us who recognize the problem, who recognize the issue, to advocate and initiate response within Pentecostalism to foster environments that support the individuals' experiences of living in the gap. So I'm calling that we need to recognize living in the gap as a legitimate issue and see how we can move forward and advocate for these people's experiences. Now, a question that arises here is, how can Pentecostalism integrate living in the gap into its theological discourse to foster awareness and transformation? Now, one practical step is creating spaces where believers can discuss their experience of the Spirit beyond triumphalist expectations. These spaces would allow believers to grapple with the realities of faith that affirm rather than suppress their struggles. Now, I foresee that navigating such discussion requires two key actions. First, Pentecostal communities must prioritize compassion. Churches and institutions need to listen to those whose experiences challenge the dominant narrative and recognize that living in the gap is a reality of faith rather than a failure of faith. Creating safe spaces outside the counselors or the psychologist's couch for honest conversation is essential.
Prayer meetings.
Second, fostering theological literacy is crucial. Pentecostal leaders and lay people need a deeper engagement with Pentecostal history, theological diversity, and insights from outside the Pentecostal Christian tradition. This will help them engage constructively with their off-script experiences, allowing for a richer and more developed understanding of the Spirit's work in human life. Churches and other Pentecostal institutions, we must avoid surface-level solutions such as new Sunday school classes or new small groups. These may act as anesthetizing practices. Likewise, defaulting to counselling, intensified prayer, increased scripture reading as primary solutions risks individualizing problem rather than addressing its systemic roots. Instead, this study suggests the need for a broader reform in how Pentecostals discuss, teach, and experience the Spirit. Pentecostal discourse must move beyond simplistic narratives of empowerment and embrace a comprehensive understanding of the Spirit as comforter, advocate, liberator, and the one who can fix the oppressor. This shift will enable Pentecostalism to address urgent issues more effectively, including depression and mental health, and foster a church that acknowledges living in the gap as a legitimate phenomenon rather than dismissing it. So that's a lot I went through here, but let me conclude. In closing, this study highlights the gap between expectations of Spirit empowerment and reality as a critical tension within how their theological and social context shape their experiences. This awareness brings both a challenge and an opportunity. The challenge is to ensure that believers do not simply internally adjust to tensions between expectation and reality. That internalized suffering is a failure of faith. Recognizing this gap as an inherent part of faith rather than an anomaly can foster a more nuanced theological understanding of the Spirit's role in human life. This shift could enable Pentecostal communities to cultivate environments that acknowledge suffering, encourage open conversations about mental health, and provide more holistic support that integrates faith with the complexities of lived experiences. Ultimately, the way Pentecostalism engages with this tension will determine whether it continues to reinforce unrealistic expectations or evolves into a tradition that embraces vulnerability as an essential aspect of the Spirit-filled life. By acknowledging life in the gap, Pentecostalism can move beyond reinforcing unrealistic expectations and offer a robust, sustainable, compassionate, and life-affirming faith.